The inventory listed 12 bedrooms, 4 reception rooms, a library, a wine cellar, a coach house, a walled kitchen garden, and 1 dependent of uncertain standing. Cecily Wren read the line 3 times. She was sitting at the kitchen table when Mrs. Finch, no, not Mrs. Finch, that name belonged to another house, another life, when the solicitor's man had come to read the new owner's terms. She had not been invited to sit. She had simply not moved from where she was standing when he arrived. And eventually he had placed his papers on the table and sat down himself. And somehow that made it easier for her to pull out a chair, too, as though they were 2 people who had decided on the same thing at the same moment. The solicitor's man was named Pruitt. He had the look of someone who delivered difficult news for a living and had made his peace with it. "The estate passes to Mr. Aldrich Vane," he said, "effective the 15th. Cecily said nothing. "He is aware of your presence on the property," Pruitt continued, shuffling his papers without looking at them. "He has indicated that you may remain in a household capacity while he conducts his inspection." Household capacity. She had grown up in this house. She had learned to read in the library upstairs. She had sat with her father in that library. On the last night she had been allowed to be his daughter openly, before the shame of her birth had become something he could no longer afford to acknowledge. And now she was to remain in a household capacity, like a leftover piece of furniture that the new owner had not yet decided whether to keep. "I understand," she said. Pruitt looked at her then, just briefly, with an expression she could not quite read. He gathered his papers and left. Cecily sat at the kitchen table for a long time after he was gone, listening to the sound the house made when it was empty. It made a lot of sounds. Old timber, old stone. It had been speaking to itself for 200 years before she was born, and it would go on speaking long after she was gone. There was something almost comforting in that. She had exactly 11 days before Aldrich Vane arrived. She spent them doing what she had always done, keeping the house, not because anyone had asked her to, not because she was being paid, because she hadn't been for 7 months, since her father's solicitor had informed her quietly that the estate was being sold to settle debts she had not known existed. She kept the house because it was the only thing left that she knew how to do, and because she did not know what would happen if she stopped. The cook, a woman named Mrs. Old, who had worked at Thornfield since before Cecily was born, came to find her on the 3rd day. "You could leave," Mrs. Old said. She was standing in the doorway to the still room with her arms folded, which was her posture when she was trying to be gentle about something she knew was not going to land gently. "Your cousin in Bath would take you in." "I know she would. Then why are you still here polishing silver that belongs to someone else now?" Cecily looked at the candlestick she was holding. It had been her grandmother's. It had sat on the sideboard in the dining room for as long as she could remember. The new inventory would list it as 1 pair silver candlesticks, Georgian, moderate condition. "Someone has to do it," she said. Mrs. Old made the sound she made when she disagreed with something, but had decided not to press the point. She went back into the kitchen. Cecily went on polishing. She told herself she was staying because the house needed her. That was partly true. She told herself she was staying because she had nowhere else to go that mattered. That was also partly true. The whole truth was something she had not yet found the language for, a feeling that if she left before the new owner arrived, before someone looked at her and recognized what she was, she would disappear entirely. Become no one. The late Earl's dependent of uncertain standing, gone. She did not know whether she believed her father had left her anything. She did not know whether she believed her father had loved her, in the end, in any way that was more than theoretical. But she knew there had been a letter. She had seen him writing it the week before he died. He had looked up and caught her in the doorway and said, in the voice he used when something was difficult, "Come in, Cecily. Sit down." And then he had told her what she already knew, about her birth, about her mother, about why he had never been able to acknowledge her publicly, and he had told her that he was sorry, and she had believed him, and she had told him so, and neither of them had found it enough, but it was what they had. "I am putting it in writing," he had said. "What you are, what you deserve." She did not know what he had done with the letter. She had not found it when she went through his desk. That could mean anything. She had chosen to believe it meant he had given it to someone, filed it somewhere, placed it somewhere it could be found by the right person. She had chosen this interpretation because the alternative, that there was no letter, that she had imagined it, that he had died and taken whatever she was with him, was not something she could sit with and still get up in the morning. So she stayed, and she polished the silver, and she waited. Aldrich Vane arrived on a gray Tuesday in October, when the birch trees along the drive had gone yellow and the gravel was wet from 2 days of rain. Cecily was in the entrance hall when his carriage came up the drive. She had not planned to be there. She had been crossing from the library to the back staircase with an armload of catalogued books, and she had stopped when she heard the wheels on the gravel. And then she had simply stood there because her feet did not seem to receive the message that she should move. He was younger than she had expected. She didn't know what she had expected exactly. Someone older, perhaps. Someone who looked like a man who bought things. He looked instead like a man who was in the habit of moving quickly and had only just learned to slow down. He was tall, dark-coated against the gray morning, and he had the kind of face that gave away very little. He came through the front door and stopped when he saw her. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. There was a pause in which neither of them said what they were thinking. His steward, a compact, efficient-looking man named Mr. Dre, came in behind him and immediately began looking at the ceilings, the way stewards did, as though structural integrity were a more pressing concern than introductions. "This is," Dre began, consulting something. "Cecily," she said. Not Cecily Wren, just Cecily. She had made that decision in the 11 days she'd had to prepare. Let him think she was staff. Let him think she was a leftover housekeeper or a junior housemaid who had somehow ended up carrying books. Let him look at her and see something unremarkable. It was safer, for now. It gave her time. "I've been looking after the house." Vane looked at her with the expression of a man filing information away. "Has it needed a great deal of looking after?" he said. "All houses do," she said. Something shifted very slightly in his face. It might have been amusement. It was gone before she could be certain. Mrs. Old appeared from the back of the house and took over with the confidence of a woman who had been managing the arrival of important people since before they were born. Cecily excused herself and went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed, a narrow bed in a small room at the back of the house, a room that had once been used for visiting ladies' maids, which was now hers, and told herself she had done the sensible thing. She had not lied. She had given her name. She had simply not corrected his assumption. She reminded herself of this several times over the following days. Vane inspected everything. He went through the house room by room with Dre and a local man who knew the land, and then he went over the land itself. And then he came back and did the house again. He had the thoroughness of someone who did not like surprises. He also had the habit of asking questions that were slightly more perceptive than they appeared. On the third day, he found her in the library, where she had been working through her father's papers. Not because anyone had given her leave to, but because no one had told her not to, and because the papers needed doing, and she was the only one who knew where anything was. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she heard him. "You know this house well," he said. It was not quite a question. "I've been here some time," she said. "How long?" She did not look up from the papers immediately. "Most of my life." He came into the library then. He moved through the room the way he moved through all the rooms. Not tentatively, but without the kind of entitlement that would have made her dislike him. He stopped at the window and looked out at the garden, where the roses were going brown in the October cold. "The late Earl," he said. "Did he have family?" Cecily's hands were very still on the papers in front of her. "Not that I knew of," she said, which was technically true. Vane turned from the window. He looked at her for a moment. "There's a portrait in the upstairs hall," he said. "The young woman in the blue dress. Do you know who she is?" Her heart did something she did not have a word for. She had sat for that portrait 5 years ago, at her father's insistence, in a dress she had borrowed from a cousin because her own were not fine enough. Her father had been very specific about the shade of blue. She had asked him why he wanted a portrait of her, and he had said, in a voice that did not leave room for argument, "Because I want there to be a record." "I'm not certain," she said. "A relation, perhaps." Vane looked at her for one moment longer than was entirely comfortable. Then he nodded and went back to examining the bookshelves. She breathed very carefully for the rest of the afternoon. The difficulty with pretending to be something you were not was that it required you to be very consistent, and Cecily was not, by nature, a consistent person. She was the kind of person who said exactly what she thought when something struck her as wrong, and who asked questions she probably shouldn't, and who had, at the age of 12, argued with a visiting clergyman about the parable of the talents, until her father had had to remove her from the room. None of these qualities were helpful in her current situation. On the 5th day, she told Vane that the east drainage field needed work before winter. She had not been asked. On the 6th day, she corrected something Dre said about the boundaries of the property. She had the survey maps in her head from 20 years of walking those fields. On the 7th day, Vane found her in the kitchen garden in the early morning, cutting back the herbs before the first frost took them, and he leaned on the gate and watched her for a while before he said, "You're not a housemaid." Cecily did not stop cutting. "No," she said. "Who are you then?" She straightened up and looked at him across the row of lavender. He was in his shirt sleeves in the cold morning, which was an oddly unguarded thing for a duke to be. The light was low and gray and very clean. "I lived here," she said. "I have always lived here. I didn't know where else to go when the estate was sold." It was the truest thing she had said to him. Vane was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You could have told me that when I arrived. Would it have changed anything?" He thought about this with the seriousness she was beginning to understand was characteristic of him. "No," he said. "I don't suppose it would have." She went back to the lavender. He stayed at the gate a little longer, and then went back inside. She had been at Thornfield for 6 weeks before she found the letter. It was not where she had looked before. It was not in the desk, not in the filing boxes, not among the papers she had catalogued in the library. It was in a book, tucked into the back pages of a battered copy of Cowper's poems that had belonged to her father's mother, shelved at the end of a row where it would not have been found by anyone who was not specifically looking for it, or who did not know that her father had had a habit of hiding things in books because he did not trust solicitors. She found it on a Monday afternoon when the house was very quiet. Vane had gone to meet with the land agent. Mrs. Old was in the kitchen. Cecily was alone in the library. She opened the book to put it back in its proper place in the catalogue. The envelope was addressed in her father's handwriting. It said, "For whoever comes after me," to be read in full. She stood in the middle of the library for a long time without opening it. Then she carried it to the window, where the light was better, and she sat down and she opened it. Her father had not been a man who expressed himself easily in speech. On paper, he was different. He had written 4 pages in his careful, cramped hand, and in those 4 pages he had said everything he had not been able to say out loud in her 26 years of life. He had written about her mother, who had been a woman he loved genuinely, and could not marry because he was already promised elsewhere when they met, and who had died when Cecily was 3. He had written about the arrangements he had made for Cecily's care, and the reasons he had kept her close without acknowledging her, and the guilt that had lived in him for all the years between. He had written, in language that was plain and careful and not rhetorical, that Cecily Eleanor Wren was his daughter, that her birth, though irregular, had been formally recorded in a document he had lodged with a solicitor in Edinburgh 22 years ago, and that the particulars of that document were appended to the letter. He had written, "She is not nothing. She has never been nothing. I was a coward, and I am sorry for it, and I am asking whoever finds this letter to do what I was too afraid to do while I was alive." Cecily read it twice. Then she folded it very carefully and held it in her hands and looked out the window at the drive, where the birch trees were now almost entirely bare. She did not cry. She had cried for her father in September, alone in this same room, when she had understood that the house was gone, and he was gone, and there was nothing left. She had finished that particular grief. What she felt now was something quieter and stranger. A settling, like a door that had been open for a long time finally closing from the inside. She was still sitting there when she heard Vane come back. She heard him speak to Dre in the entrance hall, and then his footsteps on the staircase, and then he stopped outside the library door. He knocked. "Come in," she said. He came in and looked at her sitting by the window with an envelope in her hands, and he was quiet for a moment in the way he had, the way that meant he was paying attention to something more than the surface of things. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I found something. I think it belongs to you. Or, I think it concerns you. It concerns the house and what I am in relation to it, and I think you should read it." She held out the letter. Vane crossed the room and took it from her. He did not sit down. He read standing by the window, and she watched his face while he read, because she had decided she needed to know what his first reaction was, before he had time to arrange it. He read it through once. Then he went back to the beginning and read it again. His face did not give much away, but his stillness had a different quality by the time he finished than it had when he started. He folded the letter and held it, as she had held it, and looked out the window at the bare trees. "Your name," he said, "is Cecily Wren." "Yes, and you have been." He stopped, started again. "You've been living in this house as staff." "I've been living in this house," she said. "I didn't claim to be staff. I said I'd been looking after it. That is a distinction that requires a certain amount of audacity to make." "I know." He was quiet again. She had come to understand that his silences were not absence of thought, but excess of it. He simply processed before he spoke, which was a quality she had found in very few people, and had come to respect considerably. "The document in Edinburgh," he said. "I didn't know about it until I read the letter, but you knew what you were, yes, and you didn't tell me." "No." He turned from the window and looked at her directly. Why? She thought about the honest answer, which was complicated, and the simple answer, which was also honest. She gave him the simple one. "Because I needed to know what you were first," she said. It was another 2 weeks before anything was resolved, because resolution, in Cecily's experience, did not happen quickly. It happened through solicitors and letters and documents sent to Edinburgh, and documents returned from Edinburgh, and it happened through a number of conversations between Vane and his own legal advisors that she was not present for. During those 2 weeks, she went on living in the house, which was by then a peculiar circumstance that neither of them commented on directly. She helped Mrs. Auld with the kitchen stores. She finished cataloging the library. She walked the fields in the afternoon when the weather was dry enough, and twice Vane joined her, and they talked about the drainage and the boundary walls and the tenant situation. And once, On a gray Wednesday, they talked about entirely other things. About the books in the library, about what she had read and what she thought about what she had read, about what he had studied at university and what had turned out to matter and what hadn't. She found herself looking forward to those walks in a way she found mildly alarming. She reminded herself that the situation was unresolved, that she did not know what a solicitor in Edinburgh would make of a 22-year-old document, that she did not know whether she had any legal claim to anything, or whether she even wanted to make claims, or whether what she wanted was something simpler and stranger, to be known by someone as what she actually was. His mother arrived on a Friday. Lady Vane was the kind of woman who filled rooms without raising her voice, which was a skill Cecily associated with a particular kind of upbringing and a particular kind of spine. She was in her 50s, handsome, and she looked at Cecily when they were introduced with the focused attention of someone conducting a rapid assessment. "Aldrich tells me," she said, "that you are the late Earl's daughter." "So it appears," Cecily said, "and that you have been keeping the house since he died. Someone had to." Lady Vane looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I suppose someone did," and moved on to examining the state of the entrance hall wallpaper, which she found wanting. She stayed for 5 days. On the second day, she took Cecily aside in the morning room and asked her a number of questions that had the shape of polite conversation and the substance of a legal deposition. Cecily answered them honestly, because she had come to feel that honesty, at this point, was the only position she had the energy to maintain. On the fourth day, a letter came from Edinburgh. Vane found her in the kitchen garden, where she had taken to going in the mornings because the cold air helped her think. He came through the gate and across the gravel path and held out a document that was clearly of legal origin. "The document exists," he said. "It's valid. The solicitor in Edinburgh confirms it." He paused. "You are the Earl of Thornfield's legitimate daughter, recorded and witnessed. The fact that the estate was sold to settle debts doesn't change what you are." Cecily looked at the document and then at him. "What does it change?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "That depends," he said, "on what you want it to change." She did not answer immediately, because she had learned from watching him that there was no shame in thinking before you spoke. "I want to stop being uncertain," she said at last. "I have been uncertain my entire life, about who I am, about whether I matter, about whether my father—" She stopped, steadied herself. "I want to know that it's recorded somewhere that I existed, that I was his, that I was not nothing." "You are not nothing," Vane said. He said it in the same tone he used for everything, quiet, direct, as though he were stating a fact that needed no decoration. "You were never nothing. Whatever you believe your father failed to give you, he gave you that, in writing 22 years ago. He just waited too long to tell you it was there." Cecily looked at him for a long moment. The birch trees along the drive were leafless, and the sky was the color of pewter, and somewhere across the fields a pheasant was making its unreasonable noise, and she thought, "This is the moment. This is when I find out what I am made of." "I should like to stay," she said, "not as staff and not as a charity. I would stay as, I don't know the right word for it, as myself. As Cecily Wren, who was born in this house and who knows where the drainage goes wrong and which of the tenants need watching and how to put up the kitchen garden before the frost comes. I have no legal claim to anything. I understand that. I am asking as—" She stopped again. "As yourself," Vane said. "Yes." He was quiet in the way that meant he was deciding something. She made herself wait. "I had a meeting with my solicitor last week," he said, "about certain irregularities in the original inventory." She blinked. "What irregularities?" "The line about the dependent of uncertain standing." He reached into his coat and produced the original estate inventory, the same one Pruitt had read to her in the kitchen 2 months ago. "I asked what it meant, precisely." My solicitor thought it was likely a notation from the previous estate agent, indicating someone who had not been formally accounted for. He paused. I have been thinking about what to do with it, and I think, he said carefully, that what should be done with it is to correct the uncertainty. The standing is not uncertain. The standing is clear. It has simply not been acknowledged. He looked at her. I would like to acknowledge it, if you will permit me to. Cecily did not quite understand what he meant, and then she did. And then she looked at him for a long time with the birch trees and the pewter sky and the pheasant behind her. And she thought of her father in the library, writing a letter he couldn't bring himself to deliver. And she thought of 11 days polishing silver that wasn't hers, and she thought that she was very tired of being uncertain. Yes, she said, I permit you. The announcement was made formally in January through the appropriate legal channels and, more practically, through Lady Vane, who told everyone she considered worth telling and did so with the air of someone correcting a long-standing error that had personally inconvenienced her. The document from Edinburgh was entered into the relevant records. Cecily Eleanor Wren was formally recognized as the daughter of the late Earl of Thornfield, which changed her practical circumstances not at all and her interior life entirely. She stayed at Thornfield. This was perhaps the most unusual part of the situation, and the part that gave rise to the most conversation in the county. There were several months during which Cecily was aware that she was the subject of a great deal of careful observation. From Lady Vane's acquaintances, from the neighbors, from Mrs. Old, who had known all along and was gratified to have been right about it, and from Vane himself in a way that was different from the others. He observed her the way she had once observed the house, steadily, thoroughly, as though he were interested in understanding rather than judging. She noticed, in the spring, that he had not replaced the portrait of the girl in the blue dress. She noticed, in April, that he had ordered the east drainage field repaired. She noticed, on an evening in May, when they were walking the south field boundary and the light was going gold over the hedgerows, that the distance between them was somewhat smaller than it had been in October. She was not a person who let such things go unexamined. You kept the portrait, she said. It's a good portrait, he said. That's not why. He looked at her, she looked at him. The light was very gold and the hedgerows were very green, and somewhere behind them a lamb was calling for something. No, he said, it isn't. They walked the rest of the boundary in silence, which was not the uncomfortable kind. Later, she would try to explain it to Mrs. Old, who had asked with the directness of a woman who had known Cecily since she was 4 years old and had no patience for indirection. I don't know exactly when I stopped being afraid of him, Cecily said, or afraid of this. I just know that one morning I woke up and it was gone. The fear. And what was underneath it, Mrs. Auld said. Something better, Mrs. Auld said. The wedding was in September. Small, which was what they both wanted. The birch trees along the drive had gone yellow again, the same as they had been when Vane first arrived, and the kitchen garden was full and cut back in the way she always cut it before the cold came. She had been born in this house. She had grown up in it. She had almost lost it and almost lost herself in the same season, and she had stayed because she did not know who she was anywhere else. And it had turned out that staying was the right thing, not because it saved the house, but because it gave her the time to be known. At the end of the evening, when the guests had gone and the house was quiet again, Vane found her standing in the library with a candle, looking at the shelves. "Looking for something?" he said. "No," she said, "just looking." He came to stand beside her, and they stood together in the library of the house where she had been born, and the candle made the room gold, and somewhere outside the birch trees stood bare and still in the September dark. She was, at last, entirely certain of who she was.